The call came at 1:45 p.m. right as the photographer asked me to breathe and tilt my chin toward the window. The coordinator's voice was steady but strained, saying, Mason hadn't arrived and wasn't answering his phone. And could we push the ceremony 15 minutes, maybe 30, just to be safe? Just to be calm. I stared at my bouquet of white peonies and thought how heavy it suddenly felt, how the stems seemed to sweat in my palm. Piper had slipped out to check the quartet 20 minutes earlier and hadn't come back, and a hush moved through the bridal suite as if someone had cracked a window in January. My mother turned away to dab her eyes. My father paced like he did when bills came due and the math didn't stretch far enough, and Aunt June watched me with that wise, unblinking gaze that made children tell the truth. My phone lit up with a message from Mason sent at 7:06 a.m. Can't wait to see you at the aisle, a promise now curdled by silence. I looked at the lace sleeve draped over my shoulder and wondered why something that fit so perfectly could suddenly feel like a costume. Outside, the quartet kept tuning, then stopped, then tuned again, as if they too were waiting for permission to begin. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from, in the comments, your city, your state, even your time of day, and if you're new here, tap subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this story. Sometimes, the road to justice starts with the smallest sound, like a phone that should ring and doesn't. My name is Nora, and I teach kindergarten in the same school district where my mother handed out Band-Aids and good advice in the nurse's office for 25 years. We were the kind of family that saved gift bags to reuse and kept Sunday meatloaf simple, the kind that believed in eye contact, firm handshakes, and showing up early out of respect. I grew up in Willow Bend, a place where the grocery clerk knows your coffee order and the crossing guard knows your birthday, and I never minded. There's a safety to living where people wave with their whole hand. When I met Mason, he'd just stepped into his father's construction firm, tall and easy, with a level clipped to his belt, promising he could build anything if he had a good plan and the right crew. He kissed my forehead in line at the county fair and told me I had steady eyes. And I thought that meant we wanted the same life work that mattered: dinners, at-home vacations we saved for, in a jar on the counter. Piper and I met in 2nd grade when she shared her crayons without being asked, and I spent years believing that generosity was her truest self. She was the girl whose hair held a curl through a storm, who could walk into a room and make a waiter remember her by name before she'd ordered water, and somehow she'd decided I was her person. In high school, she taught me how to fix a crooked eyeliner wing and how to leave a party without inventing a story. In college, we split rent and secrets, promising we would be each other's in case of emergency forever. When Mason proposed with his grandmother's ring at the end of a picnic in the park, Piper screamed louder than I did and immediately started a spreadsheet labeled Nora plus Mason with tabs for vendors' budgets and backup plans. It comforted me the way she took charge, like the world would bend to her bullet points and charm, and I let myself lean into it as if organization could protect a heart. Our families fit together in that polite Midwestern way, where the dads shake hands and the moms exchange recipes and pretend not to notice the wine refills. My father liked that Mason came from work boots, and early mornings my mother liked that he said please to waitstaff, and Luke liked that he could talk tool brands with a man who didn't need to Google torque. Mason took my hand in front of everyone and talked about the house we'd buy near Maple Street, close enough for me to walk to school, and I pictured our life like a floor plan: bedrooms labeled sun stretching across hardwood, a garden neat as a lesson plan. When we booked Maple Bridge Manor for the ceremony, I thought we were buying a day, but what I really wanted was a guarantee, a certificate that said our promises had been inspected and stamped. The morning of the wedding, Aunt June sat on the edge of my childhood bed and laced my shoes with those nimble librarian fingers, telling me that marriage wasn't about cake flavors or seating charts, that it was about choosing the same person when they were tired and unshaven and late. I laughed and promised I understood because Mason was the opposite of late. He arrived 10 minutes early to everything, even movies, and waited in the lobby with the patience of a man who refused to miss a preview. Piper texted me a photo of the centerpieces lined up like soldiers and wrote, "We nailed it," and I believed her the way I always had. The drive to Maplebridge was all sunlight and birds, and the kind of breeze that makes you forgive last-minute hiccups, and for a while, I let myself float on that warm, thoughtless surface. I let myself be a bride, not a woman who knows the difference between a misstep and a pattern. By the time the coordinator called the second delay, the laughter in the gardens had thinned into a nervous hum, and the string quartet had drifted into silence, bows resting in their laps. My mother squeezed my hands and whispered that traffic happens. My father asked if he should call the Clark office, and Aunt June didn't speak at all. She just studied my face like a map with a wrong turn circled in red. I tried Mason's number again and got the same clean, indifferent voicemail, then tried Piper's, and heard nothing but a call that didn't even bother to ring. In the mirror, a bride stared back at me, beautiful and hollow, and I wondered why I suddenly felt like a guest at my own life. The room smelled like peonies and hairspray, and beneath it faint but certain something sharper like metal left out in the rain. "Where did Mason stay last night?" Aunt June asked, soft but certain, and I answered before my mother could change the subject, the Willow Bend Inn, because we wanted to keep the silly tradition that the groom shouldn't see the bride in her dress before the aisle. My father reached for his keys, my mother reached for tissues, and I reached for the part of myself that doesn't apologize for asking hard questions. The corridor outside the bridal suite felt longer than it had an hour earlier, as if the building had grown to test my resolve, and still step after step, we kept moving. No one said the word hotel out loud in front of the coordinator. In a small town, even air can carry gossip. The drive to the inn took 5 minutes, the way thunder takes 5 seconds to follow lightning. And then we were in a carpeted hallway that smelled like lemon polish and old wallpaper glue, standing in front of a door with a brass number that matched the one I'd memorized from the reservation email. My father cleared his throat and asked if I was sure, and Aunt June slipped the spare key card into my palm so lightly I didn't feel its weight until it was against the lock. The little green light flashed, the latch clicked, and with everyone I loved holding their breath behind me, I wrapped my fingers around the handle and began to turn. The carpet under my shoes muffled every sound as I pushed the door open, and for a moment, all I could see was the shadowed interior of the Willow Bend Inn suite. Heavy curtains shut out most of the daylight, so the shapes inside blurred together, indistinct but unsettling. Then my eyes adjusted, and the details snapped into focus. The crumpled tuxedo jacket draped across a chair, a bridesmaid's dress on the floor. 2 bodies tangled in the sheets, as if they belonged nowhere else. It was Mason. It was Piper. The air drained from my lungs so fast it left me lightheaded. My hand trembled against the doorknob, but I couldn't let go. I couldn't move. Behind me, my mother gasped. My father muttered a curse he rarely allowed himself, and Luke made a sound that cracked somewhere between disbelief and rage. Aunt June didn't say a word, but her hand touched my arm, steady as an anchor. The scene before me didn't belong to a wedding day. A half-empty bottle of champagne rested on the nightstand, its glasses tipped sideways on a tray. Piper's necklace glimmered on the dresser in a small, careless pile, and Mason's watch lay next to it as if placed there with intention. His arm curved around her bare shoulders, her dark hair spilling over his chest, in a display more intimate than anything I'd seen between them when I believed we were all family. The weight of it crushed me, yet I couldn't look away. For a moment, the room tilted, and I thought my knees might fold, but I stood frozen, forcing myself to take it all in. Mason stirred first, his brow furrowing before his eyes blinked open. He looked around in confusion until he saw me standing there in white lace and pearls. His expression drained of color so quickly it was as if his face had been wiped blank. "Nora," he whispered, scrambling upright, his voice hoarse, guilty. The movement jostled Piper awake, and she startled, pulling the sheet across herself with clumsy urgency. She stared at me, her eyes wide, her mouth opening without words, the same mouth that had laughed with me over cake samples and cried with me when my grandmother died. "It's not what it looks like," she stammered, her voice thin, unconvincing. I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, because it was exactly what it looked like. My father stepped forward, his fists clenching, but I lifted my hand slightly, stopping him. My eyes never left Mason's. "You want to explain?" I asked, my voice sharper than I felt, as if steadiness could be borrowed in a single word. "Explain why my fiancé and my maid of honor are missing from the ceremony and wrapped in each other's arms." Mason fumbled for words, tripping over them, muttering about nerves, too much champagne, old memories with Piper resurfacing. Each word only widened the hollow inside me. Piper shook her head as if trying to undo what was visible, whispering, "I'm sorry, Nora. I didn't mean for this to happen." My hands tightened into fists at my sides, the diamond on my finger pressing into my skin like a blade. Sorry wasn't a word that patched over months of deceit. I turned to my family, their faces a storm of sorrow and fury, and I realized silence wasn't enough. This betrayal couldn't stay hidden behind the walls of a hotel room. My voice came steadier this time, carrying weight I hadn't felt before. "Call them," I said. My mother blinked in confusion. "Call who?" "Everyone," I answered. "His parents, his sister, the best man. Every person waiting for a ceremony that isn't going to happen. Bring them here. They need to see this." Mason rose quickly, panic sharpening his voice. "Nora, please, not like this. Let's talk, just you and me." I turned toward him slowly, meeting his desperate eyes. "You wanted privacy while you betrayed me. You don't get privacy for the truth." He pleaded, but I ignored him, reaching for my phone. My mother touched my arm, hesitant, but I shook my head and dialed the first number. Mason's mother answered with relief, asking where he was. I spoke calmly, each word like steel. "Room 214 at the Willow Bend Inn. Bring everyone." The line went silent before she whispered she was on her way. I made call after call, my voice unwavering, though my body trembled inside my dress. Mason and Piper scrambled, whispering excuses to one another, pulling on clothes as if dressing could cover what had already been exposed. Aunt June sat quietly in the corner chair, her gaze steady, her silence a reminder that truth once revealed cannot be returned to the shadows. The knock at the door came sooner than I expected. Mason's parents entered first, followed by his sister Claire and his best man. Their faces shifted from confusion to horror in an instant as they saw the scene, the sheets still rumpled, Piper clutching her robe, Mason pale and cornered. His mother's hand flew to her chest. "What have you done?" she whispered. Behind them came others, my cousins, my aunts, even the photographer who had been pulled along in the tide of whispers. The suite filled with people, their gasps and murmurs layering like a rising tide. Mason tried to speak, tried to claim it was a mistake, a one-time lapse. Piper's tears streaked down her cheeks as she repeated apologies, but the evidence lay all around us, and their words dissolved into the stale air. I walked to the dresser, compelled by something I couldn't name, and my hand brushed Piper's purse. Inside, beside her phone, was a hotel keycard with another logo. My stomach turned cold as I held it up. "This isn't for here," I said, my voice clear. "This is for the Grandview Hotel, room 412. I turned toward Mason, whose face gave me all the answer I needed. "Last month, when you said you were visiting your old roommate?" I added softly. Silence choked the room. I dug again, pulling out a second keycard, dated only weeks earlier. Another hotel. Another room. The truth unfolded faster than their lies could catch it, and the faces around us reflected the collapse. Months, maybe longer, they had chosen this path while I wrote invitations and fitted lace sleeves. The air thickened with whispers, with the weight of judgment neither Mason nor Piper could escape. I lifted my chin and looked at them both, my voice firm even. "You let me plan a future while you shared a present I never knew about. You let 100 people gather to witness a lie." Piper broke down into sobs. Mason stretched out a hand that I didn't take, and still, I stood rooted. My family's eyes on me, my community waiting for what I would do next. My father's jaw was rigid, my mother's cheeks wet with tears, Luke's fists tight at his sides, and Aunt June's calm gaze fixed on me with something like expectation. The sound of my own heartbeat steadied me as I drew in a breath. The wedding was over. The life I had imagined with Mason was gone. But the story wasn't finished, not yet. I glanced at the door where more guests lingered, drawn by whispers, waiting for answers. I knew then this betrayal wouldn't stay in a single room. It would have to be carried into the light. I straightened my shoulders, smoothing the fabric of my dress as if to remind myself I was still standing. "We're going back," I said quietly, more to myself than anyone else. My father's head lifted. "Back where?" "To the manor." I answered, my voice gaining strength. "To the people waiting. They deserve the truth." And with that, I turned toward the door, ready to walk back into the sunlight, with nothing left to hide and everything still to face. The ride back to Maplebridge Manor passed in silence, though the cars behind us moved like a small procession through town. My father kept both hands on the wheel, his jaw set, and my mother sat, turned toward me, a tissue clenched in her fist, but no words offered. Luke sat beside me, his arm pressed against mine, like he could hold me steady without speaking. Aunt June was in the passenger seat, gazing out the window with that calm expression she wore when the world turned upside down, but she refused to bend with it. I stared at the road ahead, my wedding dress gathered tight around my knees, my hands pale in my lap. The fabric itched, but I didn't move. It felt wrong to shift or adjust when everything else had already been ripped apart. When we pulled into the long gravel drive, I could see guests scattered across the gardens, their confusion growing as more time passed without ceremony. Some stood near the gazebo, their heads turning as our cars appeared. The quartet had set their instruments aside, and the flowers that Piper and I had arranged together the night before glowed under the afternoon sun. I felt every detail like a knife, each ribbon, each rose, each chair lined in perfect rows, symbols of a day that had already been ruined behind a hotel door. My stomach twisted, but I forced my chin higher. I couldn't let the weight of my own humiliation break me before I'd even stepped out of the car. The murmurs swelled when I walked across the grass, my veil brushing against my shoulders, the train of my gown pulling across the ground like a burden. My mother reached for me once, but I shook my head gently, and she let her hand fall. Luke hovered close, his fists clenching every time someone whispered too loudly, but I kept walking steady as I could manage. Aunt June trailed behind, her gaze sharp, her presence quiet but firm. At the edge of the chairs, the wedding coordinator met me with panic in her eyes. "Nora, what do you want me to tell them?" she whispered. I looked past her to the sea of faces, neighbors, co-workers, family friends, people who had come to celebrate but were now left waiting. My throat tightened as I said, "Gather everyone. They need to hear it." I stood at the front where the vows were supposed to be spoken, the same place where I had pictured Mason's face lit with joy as he promised forever. Now the air seemed heavy, the silence unbearable. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, their expressions shifting from concern to shock as I began to speak. My voice wavered only once, but I steadied it quickly, explaining that there would be no wedding, that I had found Mason and Piper together, that the truth could no longer stay hidden. The collective gasp cut through me like glass, followed by a rush of voices, people turning, searching, some already piecing together the story from the whispers that had spread. I stood there in my dress, every eye on me, and felt my heart split into pieces I didn't yet know how to hold. Mason stood off to the side, pale and sweating, with Piper clinging to her robe, like it could shield her from the glares of everyone who once adored her. Their families hovered nearby, caught between disbelief and shame, and the sight of them only deepened the ache inside me. I wanted to run, to leave the noise, the pity, the humiliation. My legs trembled beneath the lace, but I forced myself to stay. My father's eyes met mine across the space filled with pride and sorrow, and I drew in a breath knowing I had to finish. I told them all what I had seen, what I had found in Piper's purse, the evidence of betrayal that stretched far beyond this one day. My voice carried steady until the end, but when I finally stepped back from the words, I felt hollow, like my body was still standing, but my spirit had slipped out through the cracks. The crowd broke into clusters, voices rising, people shaking their heads in disbelief. Some reached for me with sympathetic words, but I barely heard them. My mother's arm wrapped around me, her tears wet against my cheek, but even that comfort felt far away. I moved back toward the bridal suite, needing air, needing distance, Luke trailing behind me until I closed the door and finally let the sobs come. The mirror reflected a bride who looked more like a ghost, her makeup streaked her veil, slipping her smile long gone. I pressed my hand against the cool glass and whispered the questions that had been echoing in my head since the hotel. How long had it been going on? How many nights had I been at home alone thinking Mason was working late while he was with her instead? How many times had Piper hugged me goodbye, carrying secrets in the same arms that held me? The hours blurred after that, conversations folding into one another, voices low and careful. My father came in, once his hand on my shoulder, telling me I didn't need to face anyone else if I wasn't ready. My mother brought water I didn't drink. Luke hovered near the door, like a guard, muttering that he'd never forgive Mason, never forgive Piper. Aunt June stayed the longest, sitting quietly in a chair across the room, her presence steady, her silence reminding me that words weren't always needed. Each time I lifted my eyes to hers, I found strength I didn't know I had left. Still, when the music from the gardens drifted faintly through the walls, laughter, conversation, the sounds of people shifting into something resembling a reception, I felt my chest tighten. The day had turned into something else, and I was both part of it and apart from it. When evening finally stretched across the sky, I stepped outside again, the air cooler, now carrying the scent of cut grass and fading roses. Guests lingered with drinks, their voices softer, their eyes gentler when they looked at me. Some came to squeeze my hands, to whisper that I was brave, that I deserved better. Each kindness left me aching more, because every word reminded me of what I had believed until this morning, that I was already loved, already chosen, already safe. Mason had taken that certainty, and Piper had stolen it too, leaving me with nothing but questions I couldn't answer. The lights strung across the gardens glowed warmly, but I felt none of their comfort. It was like standing in a house after the fire had burned through walls still standing, but the heart of it gone. Later, when the guests trickled away and my family gathered close, I sat in my childhood room with the dress still clinging to me, the lace heavy, the satin stiff. My mother brushed my hair with slow, careful strokes, like she had when I was a girl and couldn't sleep. My father sat at the edge of the bed, silent but steady, while Luke leaned against the wall with arms crossed, his anger still simmering. Aunt June held my hand, her grip light but unyielding, and finally spoke. "You will not be broken by this child," she said, her voice low but certain. I wanted to believe her, but the ache in my chest made me wonder if I'd ever feel whole again. That night, I closed my eyes and let exhaustion pull me under, knowing tomorrow would bring whispers across town, sideways glances and questions I wasn't ready to answer. I didn't know what I would do next, but as I drifted into sleep, I understood one thing clearly. The life I thought I was walking into had ended before it began. And somewhere inside me, beneath the grief and the shame, a seed of anger was starting to grow. It was faint, still hidden, but it was there, waiting. The morning after the wedding, I woke to a quiet house. My childhood bedroom, once so familiar, felt different now, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of yesterday. My mother had folded the gown across the chair, its train draped like a fallen flag, and the veil lay on the dresser beside the bouquet of flowers already beginning to wilt. For a long while, I stayed under the quilt, staring at the ceiling, replaying each moment in my mind, until the ache settled into my bones. I thought of the hotel room, of Mason's startled eyes, of Piper's frantic hands clutching the sheets, and I wondered how I had missed so much that had been right in front of me. Downstairs, the smell of coffee and bacon drifted through the hall, but my stomach turned at the thought of food. I sat at the edge of the bed, still in my nightshirt, when my father knocked lightly on the door and stepped inside. He didn't sit, didn't press me with words. He simply stood there, steady, as he had always been, and said, "You don't have to decide anything today. Just breathe." His voice was low, measured, and it steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. When he left, the silence remained, but it didn't feel as crushing as it had moments before. By midday, the phone had rung so many times, I switched it to silent. Messages poured in, friends, coworkers, even neighbors who had seen the spectacle unravel. Some offered sympathy. Others wanted to know details, their curiosity wrapped in kindness that felt hollow. I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them. Instead, I sat by the window, watching the breeze carry petals from the dogwood tree across the yard. The world kept moving utterly unchanged, even while mine felt splintered. It was Aunt June who finally sat across from me at the kitchen table, her cup of tea balanced carefully in her hand. She looked at me for a long moment before saying, "This is the part where you think it broke you." But it didn't. Her words landed softly, but they clung. I felt tears well again, and I shook my head. "I don't even know who I am without him." I admitted the words, slipping out like a confession. She leaned closer, her eyes clear and sharp. "You're still Nora. That doesn't change because he was weak. The question is, what you'll do with that truth." That night I tried to sleep, but my mind refused to settle. I saw flashes of Mason's hand around Piper's waist, the way they had looked so comfortable together. And then the faces of the guests as I spoke the truth aloud. Embarrassment flared hot, followed by anger that cut deeper than sorrow. I buried my face in the pillow, gripping the fabric tight, and whispered to myself, "I can't let them take more from me." The words felt like a thread pulling taut inside me, something beginning to shift. In the days that followed, the town carried the story forward, each person adding their own shade of shock or pity. At the grocery store, Mrs. Thompson from down the street patted my hand too long, murmuring, "You'll find someone better." At church, whispers rippled through the pews as I walked past the sermon on forgiveness ringing too loudly in my ears. Even at school, where I had always felt safe, parents greeted me with cautious smiles, unsure of what to say. Each encounter left me raw, like a wound rubbed open, but somewhere beneath the pain was a hardening resolve. Luke stayed close, driving me to errands when I couldn't face the stairs alone. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it came out sharp. "He doesn't deserve the air he breathes," he muttered once as we passed Mason's truck parked at the Clark office. I didn't answer, but I gripped the seatbelt until my knuckles turned white. My brother's anger mirrored my own, though mine stayed hidden beneath layers of silence. One evening, I found myself back at Maplebridge Manor. The staff had already cleared the reception tent, and the gardens looked bare, the chairs stacked neatly out of sight. I walked across the grass alone, the scent of roses still lingering faintly in the summer air. Standing where the aisle had been, I closed my eyes and pictured the moment again, the crowd, my voice, breaking the weight of everyone's eyes on me. But instead of shame, I felt something else take hold. It was as if speaking the truth had unlocked a part of me I hadn't known existed, a part unwilling to be silent again. When I returned home, I found Aunt June sitting in her armchair, knitting, as though she had been waiting. Without looking up, she said, "You've been carrying everyone else's shame on your shoulders. That isn't yours to hold." Her words struck deep, and for the first time, I let myself consider what she meant. Mason and Piper had chosen their path. I had been dragged into it. The humiliation was theirs to carry, not mine. That night, lying in bed, I whispered into the darkness, "I won't protect them anymore." The sentence steadied me, each word a small anchor in the storm. Days turned into a week, and slowly the grief dulled into something sharper. I began to notice the inconsistencies I had once brushed aside: the nights Mason claimed to be working late, the times Piper had canceled plans at the last minute, the faint scent of perfume on Mason's shirt that I had excused as someone else's. Each memory returned like a puzzle piece sliding into place, and the picture it formed was undeniable. My trust had been broken long before the wedding day. The realization stung, but it also gave me clarity. I had been blind, but I wasn't blind anymore. My parents urged me to take time to focus on healing, but my mind wouldn't rest. I walked the neighborhood at dusk, my steps carrying me past familiar houses, the air heavy with honeysuckle and the sound of crickets. With each step, I thought about what it meant to move forward. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't ready to forget. What I was ready for was truth, not just whispered in hotel rooms or revealed in front of family, but laid bare for everyone to see. The night before the second week ended, I stood at my window looking out at the quiet street. The lamplight glowed against the pavement, casting long shadows, and I felt something solid settle inside me. The grief had not vanished, but it no longer consumed me. In its place was resolve, sharp and steady. I realized I could either let Mason and Piper write the end of my story, or I could claim it back myself. My hand pressed against the glass, the cool surface grounding me, and I whispered the words I hadn't been able to say before. "I will not be their victim." When I turned away from the window, my reflection caught in the mirror. The woman staring back at me no longer looked like the broken bride who had collapsed into sobs on her bedroom floor. She looked tired, yes, but also certain. The line of her jaw was firmer, her eyes clearer, her shoulders straighter. For the first time since that day, I recognized myself. And in that recognition, I understood what had to come next. The time for silence was over. The sentence I whispered to myself that night, "I will not be their victim," echoed the next morning when I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock, and for the first time since everything fell apart, I didn't feel paralyzed by the weight of it all. I felt steady. The grief still clung to me, but underneath it, there was something sharper, something that asked not to be ignored. My first step was silence, though not the kind that came from defeat. I stopped answering messages that pried too much, or spoke in half-whispers of sympathy. Instead, I listened. I paid attention to how quickly the story spread and how differently people retold it. Some painted Mason as a man who made a mistake. Others described Piper as though she had been waiting in the shadows for her chance. The truth was far less convenient, and I decided then that if whispers could shape the story, so could I. That week, I returned to work at the school. The children didn't know what had happened, of course, and their unfiltered joy became a shield I hadn't realized I needed. They tugged on my sleeves, held up drawings, and told me small secrets about their days. It reminded me that not all trust was misplaced. Still, when I walked into the staff lounge, the conversations hushed, and I caught the sideways glances from teachers who couldn't help but wonder what it must have been like to stand in front of everyone and announce such a betrayal. I kept my expression even, made coffee, and joined in as if nothing had shifted. Inside, I was filing those looks away, noting who lingered with pity and who met my eyes with respect. I began collecting details in quiet ways. At the grocery store, I overheard Mason's cousin telling someone he had seen Mason and Piper together weeks before, tucked into a corner booth at a diner 30 miles away. At the library, a clerk I barely knew mentioned she had spotted Piper's car outside the Grandview Hotel late one night. None of it surprised me anymore, but each piece added to the picture, and I kept it all tucked away. Not written down, not shared yet, just stored, waiting. It wasn't long before Mason reached out. His first attempt came through a message long and tangled about regret and second chances. I didn't reply. The second time, he came to the school parking lot waiting by my car as I walked out at the end of the day. His eyes looked tired, and his voice carried a pleading tone I barely recognized. "Nora, we can fix this," he said, stepping closer. "Counseling time, whatever it takes. Don't throw everything away." I stopped short, my keys clenched in my hand. The weight of his words pressed against me, but the anger underneath burned hotter than the ache. "I didn't throw anything away," I said evenly. "You did, the moment you chose her over me." He opened his mouth again, but the look in my eyes must have told him not to continue. I unlocked the car and drove off, leaving him standing there, his face pale in the fading light. My hands shook against the steering wheel, but there was also relief, because for once I had spoken without faltering. Piper tried too, in her own way. She left a note folded into the crack of my front door one evening, the handwriting as familiar as my own. It said she was sorry that she hadn't meant to fall into something so wrong that she missed me. I didn't tear it up, though I wanted to. Instead, I slid it into a drawer, proof of what she had admitted in her own words. I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet, but I understood something. Then they both wanted me quiet. They both wanted me to hold their secrets, and that was exactly what I wouldn't do. I started attending more community events than I ever had before. Church suppers, library fundraisers, the town hall meeting where the mayor spoke too long about budgets and roads, places where people gathered and where conversations spread like brushfire. I didn't tell dramatic stories. I didn't embellish. I simply spoke the truth, calm and measured when asked. Yes, it's true. I found them together on my wedding day. I let the silence that followed do the rest. I could see how people leaned in, how their expressions hardened against Mason and Piper, how the whispers gained sharper edges. By saying less, I allowed the truth to grow louder. Meanwhile, I leaned on those closest to me. Luke drove me to small towns just to get away, and during one of those drives, he pulled over near a lake and said, "Don't let them rewrite this story, Nora. You're the one who gets to decide how it ends." His words stayed with me, circling in my head late at night. My mother cooked more than she ever had, filling the freezer as though food could absorb the hurt. My father remained steady, sitting at the table with his crossword puzzles, his quiet presence reminding me I was not alone. And Aunt June, she said little, but every time she looked at me, I felt as if she could already see the plan forming. One evening, I gathered them in the living room. The lamp cast a soft glow, and the house felt warm against the cool night. "I don't want to hide from this anymore," I told them. "I don't want whispers to tell the story. I want the truth out fully." My mother hesitated, worry flickering across her face. "Sweetheart, you've already endured enough. Maybe letting it fade is kinder to you." I shook my head. Letting it fade only protects them. I'm done protecting them. Aunt June leaned forward in her chair, her knitting resting in her lap. "Then we'll stand with you," she said. And I knew she meant it. The next days were quieter, but I felt a steadiness in each choice I made. I wasn't ready for the confrontation that would come later, but I was laying the ground carefully. Each truth spoken, each glance returned without shame. Each small refusal to be silenced became a brick in something larger I was building. Mason and Piper still had their story, but mine was growing stronger. That night before bed, I sat again at the window where the street lamp cast shadows across the pavement. I thought of the aisle I never walked, the vows never spoken, and the life that had slipped away. Then I thought of what had replaced it, clarity, strength, and a gathering resolve that no betrayal could undo. As the clock ticked softly in the hall, I understood that the time for waiting was nearly over. The time for silence had served its purpose. What came next would not be quiet. The decision to stop protecting them solidified inside me like stone, and within weeks the opportunity to act presented itself. Mason's father hosted the annual Clark & Sons Company dinner at the Civic Center, a gathering that always drew business partners, employees, and half the town's officials. I had been invited every year since Mason and I began dating, and despite what had happened, my name still appeared on the guest list. My first instinct was to stay away, but then I realized what the night could offer an audience, the very people whose respect Mason counted on most. I arrived in a navy dress that belonged to my mother, understated, but elegant, the kind of dress that didn't demand attention, but held it once eyes landed. Luke walked in with me, his presence a quiet assurance at my side. Conversations faltered as we entered, and I felt the weight of curiosity ripple through the room. Some faces softened with sympathy, others sharpened with speculation. Mason was already there, standing near the front with his parents, his posture stiff, his smile strained. Piper hovered beside him, not in an official role this time, just clinging to the corner of his world. I greeted people politely, offering small smiles, never flinching from their questions. When someone asked how I'd been, I answered simply, "I've been learning the truth, letting the words hang just long enough for them to grasp their meaning." The more I spoke, the quieter the room became, until whispers carried farther than the music. Mason noticed. His face paled as he excused himself from a conversation and moved toward me, his hand raised in a gesture, half plea, half command. "Nora, can we talk privately?" His voice was low, urgent. I didn't step away. Instead, I lifted my chin and spoke clearly enough for the circle around us to hear. "Privately is how secrets thrive. I think the truth belongs here, don't you?" A hush spread through the group and Mason froze, his jaw tightening. Piper looked down, her face flushed, but I pressed on. "You see," I continued, my voice steady, "while I was planning a wedding, while I was picking out flowers and writing vows, Mason and Piper were building something else behind my back. Not a future, just a lie." Gasps followed, sharp and unrestrained, and heads turned throughout the room. Mason's father's expression darkened, his hands gripping the edge of his chair, while his mother covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Mason reached for my arm, his voice cracking. "Enough, Nora." I stepped back, my eyes locked on his. Enough was the morning I walked into a hotel room on my wedding day and found you both. Enough was the purse full of hotel keys that told me it wasn't the first time. Enough was the months of lies that you let me wear like a crown. The room was silent now, every face trained on us. Piper's tears had already begun to fall, her shoulders shaking as she whispered, "Please, Nora, stop." I turned to her, my voice cutting through the quiet. "Stop. I stopped when I trusted you. I stopped when I let you sit beside me, calling yourself my sister while you betrayed me. What I won't stop now is the truth." Mason's mother rose, then her voice trembling. "Is this true?" she asked, looking from her son to Piper. The silence that followed was louder than any denial could have been. Mason opened his mouth, but no words came. Piper shook her head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The whispers swelled into outrage. Business partners who had shaken Mason's hand moments earlier pulled away, their expressions tight with disapproval. Employees shifted uneasily, the foundation of respect cracked beyond repair. Even Mason's own sister Claire crossed her arms and turned her back to him, her disappointment plain. I stood taller, my heart pounding, but my voice calm. "I don't share this to humiliate myself. I share it because the shame is not mine to carry. They chose deceit, not me. And I won't be silent so they can keep pretending." Luke placed a hand gently on my shoulder, grounding me, as Mason sagged against the table behind him, his mask of confidence shattered. Piper covered her face, tears slipping through her fingers. The room no longer looked at me with pity. They looked at them with disgust. I excused myself, then walking toward the exit with Luke beside me. Each step felt lighter, though my pulse still raced. Behind me, the noise grew, angry voices, shocked questions, the sound of reputations unraveling. I didn't turn back. I didn't need to. Outside, the night air was cool, the stars sharp above the Civic Center's parking lot. Luke exhaled slowly. "You just leveled the ground beneath them," he said. I nodded, feeling a strange calm settle into me. The breaking point had come, and I hadn't crumbled. Yet as I slid into the passenger seat, one thought carried me forward. This wasn't the end. Exposure was only the beginning. What came next would make sure their choices followed them, leaving no room to rewrite the story. The fallout came faster than even I imagined. Within a week of the company dinner, news of Mason and Piper's betrayal had spread beyond Willow Bend. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was conversations in grocery aisles, murmurs at church, and outright questions at the diner. Mason's father, a man who valued reputation above all else, could barely look me in the eye when we crossed paths on Main Street. Clark & Sons lost 2 contracts in 3 days, clients deciding they didn't want to tie their name to a family that couldn't keep its own house in order, as one of them put it. Mason called twice after that night, his voice leaving messages that swung from apologetic to angry. In the first, he begged me to meet him, insisting that we could salvage our image together, as if I owed him one last performance. In the second, his words hardened, accusing me of humiliating him on purpose, as if his choices hadn't written the ending long before I ever opened my mouth. I didn't answer either call. Each message was saved, then filed away, like every other piece of proof that reminded me I hadn't imagined the depth of his betrayal. Piper fared no better. Her event planning business, once thriving on word of mouth, began to wither. Couples canceled their bookings, citing a change of plans, but leaving no doubt why. Vendors she had worked with stopped taking her calls. I passed her once outside the bakery, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, her eyes hollowed. She froze when she saw me, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. I walked past without stopping, the sound of the bell above the bakery door closing between us, like a line drawn in stone. At school, I noticed the difference too. Parents who had once tiptoed around me now met my eyes with warmth and respect. They spoke of resilience, of bravery, words that at first felt too heavy, but gradually began to settle into me. Even colleagues who had once lowered their voices when I entered the lounge now spoke openly, their smiles genuine. I hadn't just survived the humiliation, they saw me as someone who had stood against it. It was a small kind of justice, but justice all the same. One afternoon, Claire Mason's sister knocked on my door. She stood there with a small container of cookies, her hands trembling slightly as she held it out. "I don't know if this means anything," she said, "but I want you to know I believe you." I always had my doubts about them, but I didn't want to see it. Her eyes brimmed with tears, and for a moment I saw the weight she carried too, the shame of her brother's choices pressing against her family's name. I accepted the cookies and thanked her. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement, and it mattered. At the diner the following week, I overheard two contractors discussing Clark & Sons. One of them shook his head. "You can't trust a man who cheats on the woman willing to stand beside him at the altar. If he'll do that, what'll he do with your money?" Their laughter was low-tinged with scorn, and though I didn't join in, I carried those words home like a quiet victory. Mason had always prided himself on being reliable, a man of his word. Now his word meant nothing. For Piper, the unraveling came in sharper cuts. Her closest friends pulled away, uncomfortable with being seen at her side. She posted online about false narratives and moving forward, but the comments below told a harsher truth. People weren't buying her version of events. Even her family, who had once treated me like a daughter, stopped reaching out altogether. I knew enough of small towns to understand that once a reputation frayed this badly, it was nearly impossible to stitch back together. Meanwhile, life around me slowly steadied. My mother began humming again while she cooked, my father returned to his crossword puzzles, and Luke even managed to joke with me on our drives. Aunt June remained her quiet, steady self, watching me with a knowing gaze, as if she had always trusted I would find my footing again. Each night, I sat by the window, looking at the lamplight spilling across the street, and I felt the ache ease little by little. Still, the justice I saw unfolding wasn't about contracts lost or friendships abandoned. It was about dignity returning to me. At church one Sunday, the pastor paused mid-sermon, looked directly at me and said, "Truth doesn't just free us. It protects us." I knew he wasn't speaking only to me, but in that moment, I felt seen. People no longer whispered about the girl left at the altar. They spoke about the woman who stood tall when her world collapsed. Mason and Piper became shadows in town, their appearances fewer, their presence diminished. Mason's truck, once a symbol of pride, sat more often in his parents' driveway than at job sites. Piper's shopfront office went dark, the closed sign lingering more days than not. Every time I passed by, I thought of the promises they had made to themselves while I planned a life for three of us unknowingly. And every time, I let the thought drift away, replaced by the steady rhythm of my own steps forward. The turning point came when I walked into the grocery store and didn't hear silence follow me. Instead, I heard my name spoken with kindness, neighbors greeting me not with pity, but with respect. The woman behind the counter handed me my receipt and said, "You held your head high." That's something none of us will forget. I smiled, thanked her, and walked out into the sunlight, the door closing behind me with a lightness I hadn't felt in months. Justice, I realized, didn't always arrive in a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it unfolded slowly in contracts, lost friendships, abandoned respect reclaimed, and dignity restored. Mason and Piper had gambled on secrecy and convenience, but the truth had made sure neither would protect them again. Their world had begun to collapse brick by brick, and I no longer had to lift a finger. As autumn settled into Willowbend, I felt the change not just in the crispness of the air, but in myself. The grief no longer controlled me. The betrayal no longer defined me. What lingered now was clarity, a steady awareness that I had walked through the fire and come out whole. The final step would not be about them at all. It would be about me, about claiming the peace I had earned and closing the chapter fully. By the time winter gave way to spring, I realized the storm had passed. Mason and Piper were still in town, but they no longer cast a shadow over my days. Their choices had stripped them of respect and left them isolated while I had walked forward into something steadier, something whole. The weight of their betrayal no longer pressed against my chest. It had faded into a scar, something I carried but no longer bled from. Life around me had settled into a quieter rhythm. My parents seemed lighter, their worry finally easing. Luke stopped asking if I was really all right because he could see the answer in my face. Aunt June still watched me with those clear, steady eyes, but now her smile reached further, as if she was proud I had learned the lesson she had always trusted I would. Even the neighbors who once gossiped leaned in now with kindness, not pity. And I found myself grateful for the strange way truth reshaped how people see you. Looking back, I understood something I hadn't before, that justice doesn't always arrive in dramatic fashion. Sometimes it moves slowly, brick by brick, until one day you see the walls built of lies collapse under their own weight. I hadn't needed to shout or strike back. Simply standing in my truth had been enough, and in doing so, I reclaimed more than dignity. I reclaimed myself. Mason and Piper's downfall was never my victory. My victory was choosing not to let their betrayal decide who I became. I chose peace instead of bitterness, and that choice made all the difference. I could have allowed anger to harden me, but instead, I leaned into what remained family work community and the quiet knowledge that I was more than what they tried to take from me. If there is one thing I've carried from this, it is that betrayal doesn't define us, it reveals others. And when people show us who they are, we are given the choice to either shrink under the weight of their actions or rise in our own strength. I chose to rise. Now when I walk through Willowbend, I no longer feel the sting of whispers. I feel the steadiness of belonging, the soft nods from neighbors, the gentle warmth of respect earned not through perfection, but through resilience. I've learned that the best revenge is not revenge at all. It is living a life so true to yourself that the people who tried to break you become irrelevant. And so my story does not end in bitterness, but in gratitude for the strength I didn't know I had, for the family who stood by me, and for the chance to begin again with clearer eyes. I would not wish the path on anyone, but I would not trade the woman I became because of it. Before we close, I'd love to know which part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.